This is the #1 most frequently asked React question on Stack Overflow. With over 800,000 views, it asks why setState method is not reflecting a change immediately. But the part that is really fascinating is how people are answering this question. And the first answer, the accepted one, with over 950 votes, mentions closures as the main issue behind why it happens. This is totally and completely wrong. Welcome to the concept of stale closure, which has spread to dozens of articles like a lie that when repeated 100 times finally becomes the truth. And by the way, I don't blame anyone. The relationship between closures and stale values can be very confusing. And I think that even React Docs does a very poor job of explaining it, indirectly suggesting that closures are somehow responsible for stale values. The phrase stale closure is mentioned 226 times in Stack Overflow. But if we exclude React.js stack, it's only mentioned 13 times. So is it only a React issue? We'll get back to it in a moment, but first, let's recap the canonical problem. So we write our component, then define some state and event handler. The value is initially set to 0, but we want to increment it by 1. So we log the value, we use the setState function, then log it again. Now I will click the increment button, but we see that the value was not updated. I will now read how stale closure concept tries to explain this in one of the blog posts. The handleClick function is a closure. It can only see the values of variables as they existed when the function was defined. In other words, these state variables are a snapshot in time. The idea that closure is like making a snapshot is repeated everywhere. In this blog post, closure creation is compared to taking a picture. And the thing about the picture is it cannot change. Once we have taken it, its content is sealed. But is this reasoning correct? To verify this, we'll refresh our memory a bit and check what exactly is the closure in MDN WebDocs. A closure is the combination of a function bundled together with references to its surrounding state. So basically, when you create a function, it remembers variables from its outer scope. This is especially useful if you have a function that creates and returns inner function. In this example, the outer function creates a variable count, and inner function logs it to the console. We can then use make function and later call the created function, which correctly remembers the count variable and logs it out. In many programming languages, this would not work. The count variable would be destroyed after calling make function, and using created function afterwards would lead to an error, because it's referencing a variable that was already destroyed. But in JavaScript, functions form closure with outer scope. In this example, the inner function forms closure with count variable. The code works just fine, and we use closures everywhere. In React, function components are functions that declares inner functions like event handlers. React hooks are functions that often returns other functions as well. And the same goes for custom hooks that we write ourselves. So yes, when we access state from our event handler, the event handler and the state together form a closure. But, and this is the most important but in this video, closure doesn't mean that the values are being frozen somehow, as many people suggest. And I can prove it to you very simply. Let's declare a variable, then a function. This function will use this outside variable forming a closure, and it will log it to the console. We can sneak peek into this function's closure using console.dir. Now, this is specific to V8/Chromium Developer Tools implementation, but it should be similar in other browsers. We can see a property scopes, which includes our x variable that forms a closure with our function. Now we call the function, we can see it logs 0, and we try to modify the variable. Then we call the function again. Now, if the theory that closure somehow freezes the value is correct, it should log out 0 for the second time. But we can see it logs 2. We can also check the closure again And in fact, we can see that X there also reflects the most up-to-date value. So stale values have nothing to do with the closure mechanism. Closure doesn't freeze any variables. Closure doesn't take any snapshots. It has to be something else. The real reason behind stale values is how useState hook communicates with our components. To illustrate this, we'll explore an oversimplified version of useState hook. It doesn't schedule state updates into an internal queue, which React does to batch updates. It doesn't guarantee state preservation between renders, and it doesn't trigger re-renders. But simplifying it will allow us to focus on the core mechanism of how state is being frozen. So we declare an internal state variable, which we initialize with default value. Then setState function, it accepts an argument that is either a function or a non-function value. If it's a function, we call it with current state and assign the result to our internal variable. If it's not a function, we just assign it straight away. What we return is an array of state and setState function, just like in real useState. Now let's assume that we are inside some component. We call our useState hook, then create a click handler, we log out the state. Now notice that we are reading variable declared outside of click handler function. This is the literal definition of closure. We are using JavaScript closure. Then we modify the state and log it again. We have to simulate the event, so we call click handler directly. And guess what? It behaves exactly the same as in React. The value is not being updated immediately. Why it happens? In our simplified version, the update is instant. There is no internal queue and there is no batching. So let's see how we can fix that, and it should reveal the source of the problem. We'll make only one simple modification to useState hook API. We'll call this hook useState v2. It won't return state directly as a value. Instead, we'll return a getter function that reads the value for us. Now we have to change the way we use the state a little bit. Counter is no longer just a value, it's a function. So we've renamed it accordingly. Now we call this function in each place we want to use state. And let's run it. Voila! We can read the updated state immediately. This example could be simplified even more. Let's get rid of all abstractions, components, hooks, event handlers. This is as simple as it gets. Vanilla JavaScript. We declare a variable first and assign it the value 1. Then we declare variable second and assign first to it. Now, important, we modify first to the value 2. What will be logged as the value of second variable? You can pause for a second and answer yourself. 3, 2, 1. It will log 1. This line doesn't mean that we form some magical connection that will always update both variables together. JavaScript copies the value of first, which is 1, and assigns this copied value to second. At this point, first and second are independent variables, each holding the value 1. When we modify first, we only change this individual variable and we are not affecting the second. And precisely this mechanism is responsible for values being stale in React. Now, just a disclaimer, this is not the only mechanism responsible for stale values. React also intentionally defers execution of setState updates, forming an internal queue in order to facilitate batching. But this is out of the scope of this video. Here, we are only discussing the capturing of values, which a lot of people mistakenly confuses with closures. So why so many people basically hallucinated that closures freeze state somehow? I believe that the term stale closure itself is a problem. Remember StackOverflow? 226 questions that include the term stale closure, which 213 of them are tagged with react.js. And yes, I've checked the remaining 13. They are all connected to React, just missing the tag. It looks like stale closure is a term used only in React, invented by React community. In fact, if you Google search stale closure, before 2019, you will get only 9 hits across the entire internet. Single-digit hits. After 2019, 858 hits. So what happened in 2019? Well, React 16.8 happened, the one with hooks. Hooks revolutionized the world of React, but most importantly, they made class components obsolete. In class components, to access state from other functions, we had to use this. In function components, to access state from event handlers, etc., we are now using closures. And one of the first mentions of the term stale closure that I have found comes from Dan Abramov's blog. March 3rd, 2019, how are function components different from classes? I don't know if he coined the term, doesn't matter. If you treat stale closure as a mental shortcut, it's actually not that bad. And Dan was perfectly aware how closure works. He mentioned that closures are often avoided because it's hard to think about a value that can be mutated over time. He also points out to the place where values are being frozen in function components. He calls it capturing, although here it's in the context of props, but it's the same mechanism. There is a very vivid imagery of capturing Pikachu, nice touch, but it's important to realize that this capturing, here I see the example of useState, this capturing is only a pattern that React team designed for using hooks. In other languages, this is often called defensive copying pattern, but somehow the term stale closure is what caught on. It was repeated hundreds of times, and like in the game of telephone, people started to believe that the closure itself is the source of stale values. I think that the combination of these words, stale and closure, is very, very unfortunate. Spurious correlation in statistics is a mathematical relationship in which two or more variables are associated but not causally related. I believe that we as a community have semantically fallen into this fallacy. We have mistaken a correlation where closures and staleness appears together for a causal relationship, because closures are not causing values to be stale. And this is the conclusion that I have for you today. By the way, I made a video on how you can create your own version of useState hook that updates the values immediately. So I guess you can check it out, and thanks for watching.